Welcome back to Law and Crime Network Live, and also welcome to our Sirius XM listeners. I'm Stacey Delikat, and I'm going to be taking over here for the next few hours. You've been listening to testimony in the murder trial against Shawn Grate out of Ohio. Shawn Grate convicted on 2 counts of aggravated murder as well as kidnapping, and we're revisiting that trial today because tomorrow is the penalty phase during which a jury will decide whether or not he will be sentenced to death. Now, this is a pretty disturbing case, a lot of disturbing, gory details here, and we were just listening to a victim, the victim who actually tipped police off to these murders to begin with. She was a woman that Shawn Grate had met and picked up, taken to his house, and then basically held hostage for days, tying her up and raping her. She was able to get free when the suspect, when Shawn Grate had fallen asleep, and at that point she was able to sneak away and quietly call 911. The testimony we've been hearing is pretty disturbing stuff of the conditions of this house that she was held in for days, of the brutal rapes that she endured. So we're going to go back to that in just one second, but I want to introduce my guest, Francey Hakes, a former federal prosecutor who's joining us now from Los Angeles via Skype. Francey, thanks so much for being with us.
Hi, Stacey. Thanks for having me.
So as we get ready for this sentencing phase, the penalty phase tomorrow, for our viewers and listeners out there who may not know, what does that mean? What can we expect to see when that kicks off tomorrow morning?
Well, Stacey, the penalty phase of death penalty cases is all about aggravation and mitigation. What that means is it's all about, for the prosecution, it's all about showing the jury what a terrible person the defendant is, why he's irredeemable, why a life sentence without parole is not should not be available, why it is not the best choice. And for the defense, it's all about mitigation, trying as best they can to make Shawn Grate appear somehow sympathetic so that the jury doesn't want to put him to death. It's all about calling in family members or friends or pastors or ministers to cry on the witness stand and to make the jury feel that they cannot give the ultimate penalty.
And is this a case where you expect we might hear Shawn Grate himself, give a victim impact statement?
You know, it would be pretty unusual to have the defendant testify in the sentencing phase.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean a victim impact statement. I meant to give any kind of statement to the court before the sentencing.
It would be pretty unusual. It depends on how he presents himself and whether his attorneys think that he can do himself any good or not. In this case, with these horrific facts, these brutal crimes, I'll be surprised if they put him on the stand.
Yeah, my question regarding a victim impact statement was whether we might hear from this victim, this young woman again, who we heard from during the course of the trial, whether we may hear from her or perhaps family members of the dead women.
Yes, and what a lot of people don't know is that victim impact evidence are very tightly controlled by the court. That's why you almost always see victims' families looking down, reading from statements on the witness stand, because they've been vetted thoroughly by the court so as not to contain anything particularly explosive. The victim side has to be very careful not to be seen to be playing on the jury's emotions, whereas the defense can do exactly that.
Okay, well, thanks for explaining that for our viewers and listeners who may not have been sure what was coming tomorrow. Again, we've been talking about the penalty phase in the Shawn Grate murder trial. He was convicted of killing 2 women, kidnapping and assaulting another, and we've been reviewing, going back and listening to some testimony from his trial. Right now, I want to go back in to hearing from the victim. We won't see her face on camera for those who are watching us streaming live because prosecutors are protecting her identity, but still her words are pretty chilling as she describes what it was like to be kidnapped and then held hostage and brutally sexually assaulted and raped for several days in Shawn Grate's home. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Trial Network, and welcome to our Sirius XM viewers. I'm Stacey Delikat. If you're just joining us, we've been listening to testimony from a victim in the murder trial of Shawn Grate out of Ohio, the serial killer convicted on 2 charges of murder, multiple charges of kidnapping, pled guilty to a number of other charges as well. And the woman whose voice we have been listening to is his final victim, essentially, before he was caught. Actually, she had been friends with Shawn Grate. The 2 of them had met at a local Salvation Army. They had become friendly until one day when she was over at his house, he basically grabbed a book out of her hand. She said she'd been reading a Bible and said, "You're not going anywhere." And then basically what we just heard was her describing how he he beat her, kicked her, how she was bleeding from her head as she tried to get away, but it became clear she would not be able to get away. So we're still in the early parts of her testimony, and the reason we're revisiting this trial is because tomorrow a jury will begin to deliberate over what sentence Shawn Grate will get, whether or not he will get the death penalty. I'm joined via Skype by Francey Hakes. She's a former federal prosecutor. She's in Los Angeles now. As a former federal prosecutor, Francey, I would have to think that this was the prosecution's star witness, right? This was a woman who was really on the inside and lived to tell about the horrors she experienced.
Of course, the interesting thing that makes this case a little bit unique is that you do have a surviving victim in a murder case. So the crime itself becomes much more real. I think today, with all of the different TV shows and movies that depict crime scene evidence and dead bodies all over the place, people are a lot more immune than they used to be to those kinds of graphic images. So hearing from the victim herself, a survivor, someone who escaped that fate, is very significant for the jury. You're absolutely right. She would definitely be considered the star witness.
And you mentioned, you know, we see a lot of TV shows, CSI, NCIS, whatever it is, and we also see a lot of true crime programming. And this is really a situation that maybe a lot of people have seen, you know, acted out on the big screen or actually seen in real life, but a really terrifying one when a woman all of a sudden is trapped and realizes that she's not going to be able to get away. It's really, I would think, something that maybe jurors, particularly female jurors, could relate to in the sense of that fear of that happening.
Well, it's a terrifying circumstance to contemplate finding yourself in. And from the testimony, you can hear she's tearful, she's emotional. And what I think people don't appreciate is that this happened to her 2 years ago. And still, she's clearly incredibly traumatized by it. I'm sure she has survivor's guilt because she survived where the other two women didn't. This testimony is very significant, and I don't doubt that she'll testify again in the penalty phase.
All right, Francey, well, let's go and listen to a little bit more of that testimony now. Unfortunately, it only gets worse as she recounts what Shawn Grate did to her over the days that she was held hostage in his home. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Trial Network, and welcome to our Sirius XM listeners. Also, welcome to my guest again, Francey Hakes, former federal prosecutor, joining us from Los Angeles. The past few minutes, we've been listening to testimony from the surviving victim of Ohio serial killer Shawn Grate. He was convicted of on multiple counts of murder for murdering 2 women, as well as kidnapping them and kidnapping and sexually assaulting and raping this 3rd woman. We've been listening to her testimony, really, as we said before, Francey, the prosecution's star witness, because it's rare to have a survivor in a murder case. What did you think was most significant of this last piece of her testimony? Because we did hear, while she's describing some really horrendous situations and frightening, terrifying moments, being tied up and just really terrible, disgusting descriptions of rape, she also says he was a nice guy, and we know they were friends initially.
Well, that's right, Stacey. And I think the reason that is so significant and is going to play a big part in the penalty phase is because the defense has really very little choice here. People commented about how the defense didn't put up a lot of witnesses. They didn't really fight very hard in the guilt-innocence phase. And that's because they had no real case to put up. What they're trying to do is save his life, avoid the death penalty. And by doing that, there's only a couple of ways to do it. Show that this is aberrant behavior. With multiple murders and multiple kidnappings, they can't do that. So they have to focus somehow on his mental health. Try to get the jury to see somehow that he's not responsible for what he did, or at least should not be held accountable with the ultimate penalty. And her words that he was a nice guy are going to play a huge part in the penalty phase because it shows he was normal. They interacted normally. She even said at one point, I wrote it down, she even said at one point that he acted like anybody does when they're trying to sort of make a move on you in a way that's acceptable in society. Well, that's going to be key.
You know, that's an interesting point, and I'm also wondering, you know, for listeners who are just joining us, maybe people may not remember, in the beginning of this trial and opening arguments, the prosecutor said this is not a case of whodunit, because Shawn Grate admitted to killing these women. He did multiple media interviews even, saying that he'd done it and saying that he had killed additional women, though that hasn't been confirmed and bodies haven't been found. Will that play into the penalty phase? To your point of defense attorneys, you know, arguing that he wasn't right in the head, that he had mental health issues, if he is admitting to these crimes, during the course of interviews?
Well, that's interesting too, Stacey, because what the defense attorneys will say is that, listen, he admitted responsibility for his actions. He doesn't deserve the death penalty. He's sorry for what he did. In fact, they will use the fact that he pled guilty to a number of these offenses, none of the murders, but many of the sexual assaults and the other related crimes. They will use that to say that he accepts responsibility for what he has done, so there is no need to impose the ultimate penalty, that he can be rehabilitated, that he is redeemable.
Great points there, and I actually want to go back to that about him accepting responsibility. But first, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back here with more from the Shawn Grate trial. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Trial Network, and welcome to our Sirius XM viewers. I'm Stacey Delikat, and I'm in this afternoon as we discuss the trial of Ohio serial killer Shawn Grate. Now, Grate has already been convicted of brutally murdering 2 women and raping them and abducting them as well, keeping their bodies in decomposing bodies locked up in closets, while he then kidnapped and sexually assaulted another woman, this 3rd victim, who miraculously was able to escape and call police to the scene. She is really what cracked this case wide open. We have been listening to her testimony this afternoon, and the reason we're going back to this trial is that tomorrow the sentencing phase begins in this trial, and that's when the jurors will decide whether or not Shawn Grate should face death. We're going to have a lot of analysis coming up, but first I want to go back and listen to a little bit more from that victim. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Trial Network, and welcome back to our Sirius XM viewers. We have been listening to testimony from Shawn Grate's surviving victim. Shawn Grate, Ohio serial killer, has been convicted in the murder and the abduction and sexual assaults of 2 women, and also with kidnapping and assaulting the victim that we've been hearing from, who is on the stand, her identity not being revealed because she is a victim in all of this. Her testimony, certainly the most compelling testimony of this trial, and what likely helped very much in jurors convicting Shawn Grate. I'm joined now via Skype from Los Angeles by Francey Hakes, a former federal prosecutor. And Francey, I know you said you've also been a prosecutor at the state level, and I'm wondering, when you have cases with these really disturbing details about sexual assaults, about a woman in this case who was not sexually assaulted once or twice, but it seems like was raped over and over again and tied up, why is it so important for her to give all of these details? Because I know there are times when prosecutors may opt, for example, to not show extremely graphic photos. We know in this case prosecutors did opt to not show extremely graphic videos that Shawn Grate had taken of himself raping these women. But why is it so important for her to recount all of these details? We can hear how difficult it is for her as her voice cracks, as she begins to cry at parts. But really, it's crucial for the prosecutor's case, right?
It is, and there's a couple of reasons. And by the way, we may very well see those videos in the penalty phase, because those are certainly going to be evidence in aggravation. They are an aggravating factor in the case. So I wouldn't be shocked if the prosecution does bring them in for the penalty phase. But with regard to having the victim go through this brutal testimony, I think some people probably watching wonder what the prosecutor is thinking, making her do it. Well, there's 2 reasons. First, and most importantly, is to make sure the jury understands who it is they're staring at. It's really difficult for jurors to sit day in, day out, day after day, sometimes week after week, or in long cases, month after month, and look at someone who looks normal. And if you look at this guy, he's the definition of the banality of evil. To look at him and think that he is capable, understand that he is capable of this kind of brutality and inhumanity toward women. So that's a very key factor. And then secondly, oftentimes these kinds of details, you heard the prosecutor ask earlier about whether or not he penetrated her with his penis and where was that penetration. Well, that is a fundamental element of forcible rape. And so while these details are difficult, they're often necessary for a variety of reasons, but including the actual proof itself of the crime charged.
I want to go back to just one thing you said, which is about those videos. Shawn Grate videotaped himself raping these women. He kept these videos, and prosecutors opted not to include those in the first part of the trial. So first of all, explain to our viewers and listeners why, if prosecutors had this evidence of the crime happening, they wouldn't show that.
Well, he pled guilty to those charges. So he pled guilty to the rapes, probably hoping that the prosecutors would then either agree not to play them or that the judge would not allow them to play them because they would be considered what's called more prejudicial than probative. That is, he's admitted those counts, so there's no reason to show the actual video of the rapes themselves. But the same does not apply in the penalty phase, which prosecutors are entitled to bring a wide variety of evidence in what's called aggravation. That is, to make the jury understand not just the crimes that he's committed, but who he is and why the death penalty is the most appropriate sentence in the case.
Well, there's a little bit more of that surviving victim's testimony, so I want to go back to that now, and then we'll come out with some more analysis. Welcome back to the Law&Crime Trial Network, and welcome back to our Sirius XM listeners. If you are just joining us, we have been listening to testimony from the surviving victim of Shawn Grate. He is the Ohio serial killer who was convicted of murdering and brutally raping two women. It happened back in 2016, and then kidnapping and brutally raping this third woman who we've been hearing from on the stand. Joining me is Francey Hakes, a former federal prosecutor. She's in Los Angeles, joining us via Skype. So thanks again, Francey, for being with us. I want to go back to something you said earlier as we listened to this really graphic testimony of the rapes, of being tied up, what this woman went through for several days as she was held hostage in Shawn Grate's home. You said, you know, the detail is important because, you know, this guy looks like a nice guy. He looks like a regular Joe. You said he's like the banality of evil, right? What did you mean by that? And why is it so important that, you know, the prosecution makes sure that the jurors hear this testimony to offset that?
Well, I've seen it happen a million times where you've got an offender who looks a certain way when he's arrested, although this offender still looked relatively normal when he was arrested, but some of them don't. They're tattooed faces, or they're wearing weird clothes, or they look exactly the way someone would think that an offender would look. In this case, you've got someone who looks normal. He's running around in the community. No one suspected a thing. He's got two dead bodies in his house. Obviously, no one knew that he was a serial killer. And so it's very difficult for a jury to sit in court every day with someone. I think that's one of the things that happened, for example, in the Casey Anthony case, is that they sat in the courtroom with her day after day, week after week, month after month, saw her cry, look sad, look sorry. And in this case, you've got Shawn Grate looking down as if somehow he's feeling guilty or ashamed of what he's done. And so that's what the impression is in the jurors' minds. So testimony like this is so critical to combat that so that the jurors understand that he is not who he appears in the courtroom.
Well, there's a little bit left of this testimony from the surviving victim, and up next we are going to listen to how she describes finally making her escape. Really, her being able to get away and call 911 is what led police to this house of horrors, what led police to these decomposing bodies, and essentially crack this case open. So let's go ahead and listen to that. Welcome back to the Law&Crime Trial Network, and welcome to our Sirius XM listeners. I'm Stacey Delikat, and we have been listening to testimony in the murder case against Shawn Grate. We have been listening to his surviving victim, the woman who he basically held hostage for days, tied up and raped, and who was able to escape and call police, which is what cracked this case open, led them to find the other bodies. Now, again, Shawn Grate was convicted of murder, kidnap, and rape earlier this month, though tomorrow a jury will decide whether or not he faces the death penalty. That is why we are going back and analyzing some of the key parts of this trial. Francey Hakes, former federal prosecutor, joining me now from Los Angeles via Skype. When we heard the victim describe her escape, how she was able to first call 911 and then let police in the house, there were parts where she didn't remember. She said, "I don't know." And you say that's because rape victims, it's very common for them to have a lot of trauma and really may not be able to remember every detail, although we know there were a lot of other details that she was able to recount clearly.
That's right. I mean, a great example of this phenomenon where how trauma affects the brain is in things like child sexual abuse cases. New brain studies have shown that children, for example, who are the victims of repeated sexual abuse over a period of time, chronic sexual abuse trauma, the impact on their brain development is like being involved in a high impact car accident.
Wow.
And it's similar for victims of sexual assault. They simply do not have the kind of recall that we who haven't experienced that expect them to have. Everyone thinks that when you're the victim of a sexual assault, you're going to remember it in intimate detail. Well, what did the gun look like? What color was it? What was his face like? How did he sound? How did he smell? These details, while many victims do recall many of these details, they also don't recall others. And that is because a sexual assault is actually trauma to the brain. It is perpetrating trauma not only on the body, but on the brain. And that affects the ability to recall details or even timing, when something happened, how many times something happened. You heard her say that she didn't know how many times he had sexually assaulted her. She didn't know how she opened the door to get out. And you would especially expect her to remember that, her moment of freedom. But she doesn't, because she had experienced such severe trauma.
Well, that is really interesting, though not entirely surprising, about what you say about this trauma being the same as being in the trauma to the brain being as bad as being in a bad car crash. Also, this crime happened 2 years before from when she's testifying.
That's right. I mean, obviously, she's also gone over the story multiple times. She's been asked to recount it to prosecutors, to investigators, to prosecutor's office investigators, probably, and now to the jury. So it isn't surprising that she remembers things that she told police initially, but that doesn't mean she'll ever recall some of those key details.
Well, we now want to listen to the 911 call that this victim made. Again, Shawn Grate, her captor, who has been repeatedly raping her over the course of several days, tying her up, forcing her to take drugs, pain medications, he tells her. When he finally falls asleep, she is able to somehow get free of her restraints and call 911. Let's go ahead now and listen to that 911 call. Welcome back. We just heard the 911 call that Shawn Grate's surviving victim made to police when she was able to sneak away after days of being held hostage, tied up, sexually assaulted and raped. She was able to sneak away when he was sleeping and call for help. Francey Hakes joining me via Skype, a former federal prosecutor. That 911 call, I feel like, literally transports the listener, or in this case the juror, to the scene of the crime. You sort of sense the tension and urgency in that moment. Do you agree?
I do. And Stacey, her self-possession is remarkable, simply remarkable, that she took the opportunity when she saw it, that she was able to get a phone, that she was able to call 911, convey a lot of information, and to be what appeared to be calm while the police were on their way. Their response time was excellent. I have to give props to the police for showing up, for getting the door open, and for getting her outside and getting him under arrest without incident. But ultimately, her courage is inspiring.
Absolutely. You know, you mentioned, and she's very composed during it, too. I mean, obviously, everyone reacts differently in a time of crisis or in this terrifying time. I was almost surprised, you know, granted, she's trying to stay quiet, I guess, to not wake him, but rather that she wasn't, you know, more frantic, send help, please, you know. Did that surprise you at all, her demeanor?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it all different ways on 911 calls, right? So some people react to trauma very hysterically. Some react very calmly. It's just your way. There is no one way to do it. Everyone reacts differently. And so I still think it's remarkable, because I think if you put yourself in her position, you just imagine that you wouldn't be able to convey any information, that you'd just be screaming and wailing. That she was able to take days of torture, survive that, and have that self-possession to call for help is nothing short of miraculous.
Absolutely. And just to remind our viewers and listeners, we are revisiting this case, which Shawn Grate was convicted earlier this month on multiple charges of rape, assault, murder, because tomorrow he will be sentenced. The penalty phase begins, and that's when the jury will decide whether or not he gets the death penalty. We now just listen to the entirety of this woman's testimony while prosecutors were speaking with her, but defense then cross-examined her. So let's go ahead and listen to some of that. Welcome back to Law and Crime. I'm Stacey Delikat, and welcome back to our listeners on Sirius XM Radio. We have been listening to the cross-examination of Shawn Grate's surviving witness. Just a reminder, Shawn Grate convicted on a number of murder, rape, kidnapping charges, set to be sentenced tomorrow. The jury will decide whether or not he gets the death penalty. We're going to take a quick break, and then I'll be right back with my guest, Francey Hakes, as we continue to analyze this case. Stay with us. Welcome back to Law and Crime Trial Network. I'm Stacey Delikat, and welcome to our Sirius XM viewers, channel 109 as well. All day we have been going back and revisiting the murder trial of Ohio serial killer Shawn Grate. Earlier this month, a jury convicting him on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, rape, in the death of 2 women and in the kidnapping and rape of a 3rd woman. That 3rd woman giving some very pivotal, moving, and disturbing testimony during this trial. My guest, Francey Hakes, a former federal prosecutor, joining us from Los Angeles to analyze this case. We're talking about it because tomorrow is the day that Shawn Grate's sentencing phase begins. That's when the jury will decide whether or not he will get the death penalty for his crimes. We're going to have a lot of analysis coming up on this over the course of the next hour. But first, let's go back to the testimony of that 3rd victim where we last left off, Shawn Grate's defense attorney cross-examining her. Welcome back. I'm Stacey Delikat, and thanks to our Law and Crime Trial Network viewers for being with us, and thanks also to our Sirius XM channel 109 listeners. We have been listening to the cross-examination of victim number 3, Jane Doe, as she is known to us, in the murder trial of serial killer Shawn Grate. Grate, of course, convicted earlier this month of brutally raping and then murdering 2 women, and then kidnapping, raping this other woman who we've been hearing from on the stand. I'm joined via Skype by Francey Hakes, former federal prosecutor. She's in Los Angeles. We've been listening to this witness on the stand now for some time, and it is interesting that the contrast that the defense attorneys are trying to paint here, right? For a while, we listened to some very harrowing testimony from this woman about what she endured, the multiple rapes, being tied up, being forced to take drugs, just the terrifying moments. And now this defense attorney is talking about how they made peanut butter sandwiches together, how they read the Bible together. Is any of this surprising to you, the strategy that he took?
No, Stacey, I mean, it's very clear that he is trying to pull the jury out of that house, that he is desperate to pull the jury out of that house where all those crimes occurred. And more importantly, he is setting up for the penalty phase. So I've now decided that he's not going to try some kind of mental health defense because he probably has 0 evidence that the defendant had any mental health issues, and the prosecution probably has plenty of witnesses to say that he seemed normal, just like Jane Doe is talking about here. So what he's trying to do is make the defendant look redeemable, talking about religion, talking about the Bible, talking about peanut butter sandwiches, and how he was courteous to her, how they would take walks. And very importantly, you heard a very critical piece of evidence just now. You heard the defense attorney ask her whether or not he did anything to her in the secluded wooded area when they went there. And of course, the answer from the survivor was no. So I suspect we're going to hear arguments from the defense in the penalty phase that this defendant, whose name I won't even use, that this defendant was not some ravening beast, but somehow swept away by emotions at the last minute, but is sorry. He's admitted most of his crimes. He's accepted responsibility for them. He's found religion or already had religion. And so, jury, you can forgive him and he will accept a life sentence. But death is wrong in this case. That's where I think the argument is going.
And again, to our viewers and listeners, that penalty phase, the sentencing phase, beginning tomorrow, and that is when the jurors will decide whether or not he should get the death penalty. Let's go ahead and listen to the rest of the victim's testimony while she is cross-examined by the defense.
Was it?
Welcome back to Law and Crime, and welcome back to our Sirius XM viewers. If you're just joining us, we've been listening to testimony in the Shawn Grate murder trial. Shawn Grate convicted earlier this month on a long list of counts for murdering two women, kidnapping and raping them, and then kidnapping and raping this third victim who did survive and managed to call 911. Leading police to this house of horrors where Grate had the other bodies. Francey Hakes, former federal prosecutor, with me via Skype. This victim's testimony essentially just wrapping up the cross-examination. We are talking about this case again because tomorrow the sentencing phase begins, and that's when jurors will deliberate as to whether or not Grate should face the death penalty. So here it seems that the defense attorney is really setting up for this penalty phase. I mean, we heard him say, you know, was he in a frenzy at times? She said, well, he was in a calm frenzy. What was the significance of that when he kept trying to, ask her, was he obsessed? Was he in a frenzy?
Yeah, Stacey, when I heard him ask her and use the word frenzy, it was sort of a eureka moment for me. As a prosecutor looking at the strategy of the defense attorney here with this most critical witness, I think I see it a little more clearly now. And that is that the defense is trying to set up that he's a normal person, he's calm, he's courteous, he doesn't attack her in a secluded area, but he's called by God or some sort of frenzy overtakes him in these moments, and he feels compelled to engage in this kind of assault behavior. I think he'll also use what the offender did with the poor women's bodies of the other women that he murdered, leaving them in the house as examples of how this is no master planner. This isn't a guy who's premeditating these crimes. He's not someone who's going out hunting women and then burying them in the backyard or throwing them down a dark hole or in a lake. He keeps them in his house because he's not right in the head somehow, that he is in this frenzy when the crime happens, and then he just sort of forgets about it until it happens again.
As we look to tomorrow when the sentencing phase begins, this victim who survived, as we mentioned earlier in this broadcast, is essentially the prosecution's star witness. Do you expect her to deliver another statement tomorrow before the sentencing, or do you think jurors have already heard plenty from her when she recounted the harrowing details of what she went through?
Well, it's one of the most difficult things for victims and victims' families because the penalty phase, a new trial basically starts. Even though the jury has heard all the evidence, the prosecution is under the obligation to prove every element of the defense of the offense that makes it death eligible. And so that means going over much of the same evidence and the same testimony that has been given must by law be given again. So I would expect to hear from her again. And as I said earlier, I expect we may, unfortunately, or at least the jurors may actually end up seeing those rape videos that the defendant made, because the prosecution is trying to show the jury that he's irredeemable and that the death penalty is the only penalty that is justice delivered in this case.
Well, those videos certainly will be disturbing for jurors to see if the prosecution does opt to show them. We are going to take a quick break, but when we come back, you will hear from the detective who interviewed this serial killer. It is chilling testimony, and that's coming up right after this break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live. I'm Stacey Delikat, and welcome back to our Sirius XM listeners as well. We have been listening to testimony of Detective Kim Major. She is the detective who interviewed Ohio serial killer Shawn Grate. As a reminder for those just joining us, Shawn Grate convicted earlier this month of murder, of rape, and kidnap. One of his victims did survive. She managed to get away and call police and lead them to this house where they found these two terribly decomposing bodies. The reason we're going back to this case is that the penalty phase starts tomorrow. That's when jurors will deliberate as to whether or not Shawn Grate should face the death penalty. I'm joined by former federal prosecutor Francey Hakes. We've just been listening to that detective, as I mentioned, Detective Kim Major. Did the prosecutor's questioning surprise you in any way? I mean, he's sort of stating the obvious when he says, does tying someone up, binding them to the bed, does that seem like a mutual intention to get married, right? Because she has testified that Shawn Grate said that he thought he might marry this surviving victim.
Well, exactly. What he's trying to do clearly is to remind the jury that there is nothing volitional, nothing voluntary in this case at all with respect to these three victims, the two whom he killed and the one who survived. And the prosecutor is doing his job and taking every single opportunity to remind the jury of the horror that this offender intended to visit upon these women. He's thinking, the prosecution had to know the defense had no real defense, right? The defendant has confessed. So they know going through the guilt innocence phase that they're really focusing on the penalty phase. And so they're making sure that they're drawing the jury's attention as often as they can to the horrors of this case so that they never forget it, no matter how many times the defense stands up and talks about peanut butter sandwiches.
You know, a question I want to ask you, our viewers who are watching us live streaming may have seen a banner at the bottom of the screen saying that Shawn Grate, the jury convicted him in just a matter of hours. They deliberated for just a few hours after this trial. Do you expect that it will be equally short deliberations when it comes to deciding on his fate, or do you think when the death penalty is involved, jurors tend to take a lot more time?
Yeah, I think it'll take a lot more time. I think if memory serves, it was about 11 hours or 11 and a half hours the jury deliberated in this case for guilt innocence, which was really not even a close question. You could actually think to yourself, what were they doing for 11 hours for a guy who's confessed, and you have him recorded confessing? So the answer is that juries take their responsibilities very seriously. And when the death penalty is an available penalty, it heightens all of that. There will be a lot of discussions in the jury room, and all those jurors had to be death qualified or death eligible at the beginning of the case. So all of them said that in the right circumstances, they could vote for the death penalty. But that is a very different thing from actually getting in the jury room and feeling the weight of that responsibility. I've seen it happen time after time after time where jurors come out after, usually there's a deadlock because there's a certain number of jurors who can find the death penalty or impose the death penalty. And one or two or three or four will come out and say, I just couldn't do it. Even though they said they could, sometimes they can't. So the prosecution is really focused on those few people that might be wavering during the penalty phase.
Great analysis there, Francey. Let's now return to Detective Kim Major on the stand, hear a little bit more of her testimony about what happened when she interviewed Shawn Grate. Welcome back. I'm Stacey Delikat. We were just listening to testimony from Kim Major, a detective from the Ashland Police Department in Ohio. Ashland, Ohio, that is where these heinous crimes were committed by Shawn Grate. And we just heard the detective testifying about evidence that was found away from the scene, which Shawn Grate led them to. She was referring to a cell phone of Elizabeth Griffith, 29-year-old Elizabeth Griffith, one of Grate's victims, who he abducted, raped, and murdered. Stacey Stanley, a 43-year-old, was the other. And of course, there is this third Jane Doe who did manage to escape and survive, from whom we heard some pretty compelling testimony. Francey Hakes, former federal prosecutor, has been with us all afternoon, helping us analyze this trial as we get ready for sentencing, which begins tomorrow. We were talking about the death penalty, which this case is, and how it can be really difficult. While the jury may be quicker to convict him on the murder charges, when it comes to the death penalty, there is a lot more at stake, obviously. I'm just wondering, because I know we talked about, Francey, how the defense is doing everything they can to show that Shawn Grate is redeemable. He read the Bible, he was religious, he was friends with this woman, a normal person, really. So I'm wondering whether, and I asked you this at the beginning, but based on all of that, whether, you think we may hear from him in this sentencing phase. Basically, from court documents we have, the court has advised the defendant, Shawn Grate, that he may make a statement during the sentencing phase of the trial under oath or not under oath. If it is under oath, then the prosecutor may cross-examine him. So what do you think? Do you think there's any chance we will hear from him, hear some kind of apology?
I think there's a chance. I think there's a chance. I don't really think there's a chance he'll do it under oath because his attorneys are not going to want to subject him to prosecution, cross-examination, giving them the opportunity to go through every gruesome detail of every crime charged and force him to either admit it or deny it. But I think, Stacey, one really important thing just happened with the detective's testimony behaviorally. We talked a lot today about how the defense attorney, as you said, is trying to depict the defendant as being, just an ordinary guy who somehow had these frenzied attacks, but that's not normally who he is, and you can feel safe with him in jail versus having been executed. Well, what was really interesting from the detective was the fact that the defendant got rid of key pieces of evidence, which shows a consciousness of guilt, which really negates this idea of him having been in a frenzy. I'm thinking that behaviorally, keeping the bodies in his house was an act of power and control, but getting rid of the evidence is consciousness that he doesn't want to be caught, and that is wholly inconsistent with someone who is acting in an unconscious or unaccountable frenzied attack. So that testimony, while it seemed really small, is going to be hugely significant, I think, in the penalty phase.
Well, that's a great point, because clearly that was a deliberate action to take the cell phone and the other evidence, drive away from the home and ditch it there. So that is certainly an interesting point, and we will see whether that does play in the sentencing hearing. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be back with much more. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Trial Network, and welcome to our SiriusXM Channel 109 listeners. I'm Stacey Delikat, and if you're just joining us all afternoon, we have been analyzing the murder trial of Ohio serial killer Shawn Grate. He was convicted earlier this month of a long list of charges, but in the kidnapping, rape, and murder of 2 women, and in the kidnapping and rape of a 3rd victim, whose testimony we have heard. I have Francey Hakes, former federal prosecutor, still with me via Skype. She's been giving us some great analysis about what we can expect as we get ready for the sentencing phase to begin tomorrow. That is when jurors will decide whether or not Shawn Grate gets the death penalty. But first, for those of us who are just joining us, I want to now go to a recap of the surviving victim's testimony, because as Francey and I discussed earlier, she was really the star prosecution witness in this trial, and she is someone that we will likely hear from again in the penalty phase. So let's go ahead and listen to this recap.
The surviving victim, who escaped from a suspected serial killer by calling the police while he slept, took the stand. The unidentified victim described how she first met with the defendant, Shawn Grate, who is accused of kidnapping and sexually assaulting her and is charged in connection with the murders of 2 other women.
What's the problem? I've been abducted. Who abducted you? Shawn Grate. Where's she at now? Asleep.
She claimed Grate was like an older brother to her before he snapped.
So when he started pulling the Bible from my hands, I just looked up like curious, like, what are you doing? And that's when he says, you're not going anywhere. I tried to push him away and get up. I was just doing everything, trying to kick, punch, but everything I did, he just did it so much harder. I think when I stopped struggling and fighting, he asked me if I had enough, and I think I just remained motionless, and so he released his hands. He started pulling off my clothes.
The victim described the assault she endured at the hands of the defendant.
At some point on the night of the 11th, were you sexually assaulted?
Several times.
How were you assaulted?
In every way imaginable.
Grate faces 23 counts, including aggravated murder and kidnapping. If convicted, he could face the death penalty. For Law and Crime, I'm Rachel Stockman.
Welcome back. So that was just a recap of the surviving victim's testimony, Jane Doe, as we are referring to her. And as you saw, we didn't see her face because prosecutors are protecting her identity as a victim of sexual assault. Francey Hakes, former federal prosecutor, is still with me via Skype. And Francey, I want to go back to an interesting point you brought up now about how much trauma this woman must have endured. It's no surprise when we hear her testimony and we hear her describe the horrific rapes, being tied up to a bed, being forced to take pain medications, the defendant forcing himself on her. How difficult is it for her to then again have to testify a second time in the penalty phase, which we do expect her to do?
Well, Stacey, imagine having to talk about your sex life to a room full of strangers with cameras in the courtroom and thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of people watching. Nobody wants to do that. Now imagine having to talk about what were probably the worst few days of your entire life that included sexual assaults that you couldn't stop, that you tried to stop, that you didn't stop. Of course, it's not her fault. But there's going to be in her mind, as is very common with sexual assault victims, feelings of guilt. So she is going to have to go through this process probably all over again in the penalty phase. It is incredibly difficult for survivors of sexual assault to describe those assaults to detectives, much less than prosecutors, than room full of strangers. It is very difficult for them. And I have to say, she's very composed on the witness stand. She was very composed when she was cross-examined. She is a profiling courage in this case, there's no doubt.
Absolutely. Well, how did the prosecution wrap up their case for those who did not watch the trial here gavel to gavel? Well, we're going to show you some of that now. Let's go back to the prosecution's closing arguments, and then we'll be back with Francey for some final thoughts before the sentencing phase gets underway tomorrow. Welcome back. I'm Stacey Delikat. That was the prosecutor in the Shawn Grate murder trial, hammering home the point to the jury, this ahead of their deliberations, which ultimately did convict him on murder charges. I have Francey Hakes, former federal prosecutor, still with me from Los Angeles. The prosecutor is saying everything the defendant does is premeditated, and that's a point, obviously, they really want to hammer home going into the sentencing phase tomorrow.
The murders after the crimes. And that is, as you say, Stacey, exactly designed to address the penalty phase. That this is not a frenzy, this is not thoughtlessness, this is not someone who can't control his actions, this is someone who is dangerous, who will always be dangerous, and that therefore, because of the severity of the crime and the defendant's future dangerousness, the death penalty is the only possible penalty that is justice in the case.
What are your final thoughts, given your experience and background? I know it's difficult to predict anything. It's difficult to predict a verdict. What are your final thoughts as we head into this last phase as to whether Shawn Grate may ultimately get death?
Well, if ever there was a case designed for the death penalty, this is it. That if there's no question about the defendant's guilt, he's admitted it. There are multiple aggravating factors here. There are multiple victims. He's clearly a very dangerous, violent predator and deserves the death penalty as the death penalty is written. But it is still very difficult in today's day and age to get the death penalty when life without parole is offered as an alternative. It's easier for jurors. They don't have to feel the weight of that kind of verdict, of being the ones to decide someone no longer has the right to live. That is a very difficult burden. But here you're talking about someone, if you look at the news over the last several months, you constantly hear about killers escaping from prison. One, not too long ago, one convicted murderer escaped from prison and killed the warden's daughter on his way out of the compound. So Grate is the kind of person for whom the death penalty was intended. That being said, it is still very high burdens for the jury to contemplate, to think about, and for the prosecution to get 12 people to go back in a room and all agree that the defendant doesn't deserve to live.
Absolutely. I mean, it is a very heavy decision for anyone to make. I want to ask one other question. For our viewers and listeners just joining us who may not have been following the case that closely, it's interesting to note that Shawn Grate admitted in interviews multiple times to killing 3 other women. Now, they haven't found the bodies. That hasn't been proven. But from here, once this penalty phase wraps up, do prosecutors go back to the drawing board and say, okay, let's look at these cases now? Have they been already trying to tie them to him, do you think? What about these other women that Grate claims he murdered? Is it over once he's sentenced to death for these 2 women's murders?
Well, no.
If he is sentenced to death?
Yeah, definitely not. It's not over even if he gets the death penalty, because there will be years of appeals and there's no guarantee that there wasn't some kind of mistake made in the case. And so prosecutors in other jurisdictions, if they feel they can prove these other murders, may very well bring murder charges. It's also for the victims and the victims' families so that their loved one has a sense of justice for their case as well. I wouldn't be surprised to see him charged in the future. I wouldn't even be surprised to see those murders brought in as evidence in aggravation if the evidence is strong enough. The prosecutor may be able, if the judge allows it, to bring that evidence in as well.
Francey, thank you so much for all of your insight and analysis today. You've really helped shed light on this case. That will do it for us here today on the Law&Crime Trial Network. Be sure to tune in 9 a.m. Eastern. That is when the sentencing phase of the Shawn Grate murder trial gets underway. So be sure to tune in for that. In the meantime, have a great day. Thanks so much for being with us.